I wanted to do a brief addendum, a kind of coda to my lecture, a brief one on my lecture on the early whalers, and I wanted to add something really sort of just important to give us a sense of what we are looking at. And it's just to encourage you to go dipping into those early records, and you can find them. It will be the early original Wailers, the early recordings. You can find these on YouTube very easily. I identified. In fact, one of the ways to do it would be to go to Wikipedia, and it has a discography, and then you can sort of plow through it and listen to it. Listen to the early music, which would be the ska music, the rhythms and the sound of ska music, a more syncopated and therefore more frenetic kind of music style, and then something that slows it down into rock steady in the mid 60s. And then the emergence of this reggae sound, which is very influenced by dub and dancehall later on. Also, keep in mind that I think it's very important to keep in mind that these albums were being produced by major producers, Cox and Dodd, Leslie Kong, Lee Scratch Perry. These are very important names to the movement of early Jamaican music. And during this time, they're pioneering sound, they're pioneering voice, and so on. And they're developing these wonderful session musicians that are developing the ideas that will become really important later on. Some of the earliest writing then that we see Bob Marley doing is in that period, and there are songs that will come later on in albums um, Kaya. There'll be songs that Sun is Shining, The Weather is Sweet, written in that period, Stir It Up, written in that period. Song after song had their first incarnation during that period of incredible activity and incredible writing. What we see in the experience of Bob Marley and the Wailers is a regrouping and a sort of recasting of their music for broader engagement, but really because what they were doing was changing and developing a music style and a music form called reggae music, roots reggae music, in the 1970s that would then draw on that lyrical power. Of course, Marley was writing new songs during the 70s and so on, but it's always good to know that this work comes out of a beginning. And so we can say that the early Marley and the Wailers, had about four albums for that first period, that first 10-year period, between 61 essentially and 1971. And one was, of course, but the Wailing Wailers, which was a massive album with all the scat tunes and so on and so forth, that was released by Cox and Dodd, and it had some interest, some success, and so on. Hugely popular in the dance halls, and very sold well in Kingston, in Jamaica, which was not an insignificant market, but of course they saw very little money out of it. When they come back together after the return of Bob Marley to Kingston, they decide to form their own recording label. They would borrow a studio, but they decided to print their own records. They built their own little small shop, and that label was Wailing Soul. And Wailing Soul would never leave. It would never disappear. It would parlay into another label that would be Bob Marley's own label called Tough Gong. And Tough Gong is still one of the major studios and recording labels in Jamaica, and of course with great influence around the world. And again, that was something that was Bob Marley's invention. So there's a whole industry of how these artists began to wrest control and of course wrest the financial possibilities of their work. Um, so what we see happening, of course, in this latter part, in the late 60s and early 70s, is that Bob Marley begins to work with Lee Scratch Perry. And with Lee Scratch Perry, this band, which brought in some of the early beginnings of the Wailers that we come to know, the session musicians, the sidemen would be Family Man Barrett and Carlton Barrett, brothers who were drum and bass, and they would emerge during that time. They worked with a band called the Upsetters, and they would come to be part of Bob Marley and the Wailers. Lee Scratch Perry was a great producer, and I think Lee Scratch Perry brought out something in Bob Marley uh, that was innovative and that was dangerous. Now, Lee Scratch Perry was not universally loved by somebody like Peter Tosh, certainly by Bunny Wailer. They didn't trust him, but Perry was doing some really incredible things with sound and with production and created these two real albums that for many of the sort of deep aficionados of reggae music and Bob Marley's music regard as the quintessential Bob Marley. So we've got Soul Rebels. That's an album that comes out in 1970, produced by Lee Scratch Perry and of course the Wailers themselves. And then Soul Revolution Part 2, which was released in 1971. And so we get these four very important albums that are sort of the beginnings, the way to begin to understand an emerging Bob Marley and the Wailers. And it's an understanding that comes out of that period. Remember, this is 1968, the assassination of, of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, the assassination of Lumumba, coups in Africa, the difficulty of apartheid and the growing resistance to apartheid, the underground movement, revolutionary movements taking place around the world. And it's a very interesting time, and artists are thinking about these things. And running through this is the slow movement of Bob Marley towards Rastafarianism, which begins in the early 60s. And by the time we get to this period, in the late 60s into the early 70s, Marley is full-blown Rastas, Peter Tosh is full-blown Rasta, and Bunny Wailer are full-blown Rastas. And therefore, the Rastafarian movement is feeding their art, but it's also feeding their political ideas, their revolutionary ideas, their thoughts, and what is happening. So think about those albums and pay attention to them and sort of look at them. And then we can see what happens then when they sign with Island Records. As you know, they signed with Island Records in about 1971 and 72, and then there are two albums that the original Wailers do before that band breaks up, and they begin to have their own solo careers. Bunny Wailer, Peter Tosh, and Bob Marley, and then Bob Marley and the Wailers, the explosive touring group um, that we now come to know as the great group emerges, and it's really an artist that emerges in his own right at that period. So those are just some codas that I want us to keep in mind, um, even as you're doing your reading and you're doing your thinking about that period. I should also add that we are talking about Mali being almost inextricably tied to the emergence of Jamaica as an independent country. Jamaica gains its independence from the Britain in 1962. Mali's first recordings come out in 61, 62. There's a sense in which the beginning of Marley's career is the beginning of the idea of Jamaica, the independent nation of Jamaica, and it's a nation that is torn in its own sense of itself, its own identity, its blackness, that is wrestling with the blackness, resisting the idea of Africa. And then slowly, by the time we get into the 1970s, because of the work of the Rastafarians, because of the work of Bob Marley and the Wailers, there's a growing recognition, a growing awareness of the connectiveness and the fact of the history of people of African descent in Jamaica and the importance of that. Because the truth is that the working class never lost sight of that connection. And of course, what we see happening is Bob Marley and the Wailers begin to emerge as a new phenomenon, a new force, and they are part of a larger movement that included people like Toots and the Maytals, Bunny, Burning Spear, Desmond Decker, singing songs like the Israelites, and therefore there's a real spiritual awakening and a political awakening that is taking place in the 60s as the country is coming into its own self and its own maturity and its own understanding of itself. But that emergence is fraught, it's violent, it's conflicted, it is aware of racial dynamics, and it begins to be aware of the global positionality of Jamaicans in the world. And all of this is what becomes the context for the emergence of Bob Marley and the Wailers, the artists. So we'll stop there and just again, as a brief coda, well, not as brief as I thought it would be, to our exploration of the early Marley and the Wailers.